Fire Emblem Fates has many things going for it, level design being one of the game's strongest aspects, especially in the case of Conquest. But with that said, Conquest is notorious for being hard, and I mean hard. Conquest is catered towards more veteran Fire Emblem players and wants to offer them a real challenge, and well, you certainly succeeded there, Conquest. While I don't think it's the hardest Fire Emblem game I've played, that's still Radiant Dawn, I won't deny that Conquest really pushes my skills and patience, and nowhere was this more evident than in the worst chapters in the game. Conquest to me has some of the strongest level design in just about any Fire Emblem game, but even amongst the slew of greatness, there were a few chapters that were either mediocre or just plain awful, though I will admit even some of the worst chapters had some, if not quite a few, redeeming qualities, and today I'm going to be counting down which of them I hated the most.
Chapter 10, Chapter 10, Chapter 10.
I warned you many times in the last video. We get it, now shut up! Just like with the last video, 1. This is just my opinion, and if you like any of these chapters, that's perfectly fine. 2. I played Conquest on Hard Mode Classic because that's how I play every Fire Emblem game. 3. Paralogs won't be included because they're going to get their own list at some point. 4. The first 6 chapters aren't included. And finally, spoiler warning for Conquest. And with all that cleared up, it's time to head straight to the depths of hell and tackle the worst chapters Conquest had to offer. These chapters were brutal, unforgiving, relentless, showed you no mercy, and beat many players to the point in which they lost their will to continue. Still not as bad as Radiant Dawn! You know how in just about every Fire Emblem game there's that one unit that eventually gets so overpowered they can steamroll the rest of the game? I mean, once Ike becomes a Lord in Path of Radiance, you pretty much won. Well, in Conquest, I have yet to see a unit steamroll the game by themselves, but there was one chapter where Corrin pretty much did all the work, and thus, he gets to stand on the Black Pillar. Well, I've heard of better ways of experience grinding, but I guess this will have to do. Starting off this list, we have chapter 15 from Conquest, the Black Pillar. Now this chapter isn't actually bad or anything, and it ties heavily to the main story, not to mention being rather original, but it's not the most exciting chapter unless you really enjoy watching Corrin steamroll the enemies by his or herself, and personally, I'm more of the type to use many units rather than just rely on one, unless it's Hara Nefni and Alynceus Gambit, because those two are the stuff of legend. In chapter 15, Corrin is pondering whether or not siding with Nohr was the right thing, but Corrin's trail of thought is interrupted when he spots Azura, who he wants to talk to about the situation, but Azura for some strange reason starts walking into the lake fully clothed. What? Did you really smell that bad after dancing in the opera house? Anyway, Corrin follows suit and finds himself up in the Deep Realm, but before Corrin can get any answers, they are attacked by invaders and must fight their way through them in order to get back home, along with Gunter. Hey buddy, good to see you again. In this chapter, you have control of 3 units and you must defeat either the boss or escape within 20 turns, so at the very least you have the option of doing one or the other. What's unique about this chapter is that by activating the Dragon Vein, you can make duplicate copies of all 3 units to tackle the enemy on the other side of the map. I find this to be a very cool concept that allows you to gain more experience points, and it is the only way you can fight the boss of the chapter, and I feel this type of mechanic could make for some really awesome chapters if they use it again. The chapter itself, however, is rather dull though, since for the most part you're just going to be using Corrin to face most of the enemies, and while Azura and Gunter certainly help, most of the map is just watching Corrin activate Dragon Fang over and over again. Once the chapter is complete, everyone makes their way back to the real world, and Azura suggests that Corrin dethrone Garen in order to change Nohr from the inside and prevent further conflict from either nation, and just to be safe, she shows Corrin Garen's true form in case Corrin needed further convincing. While not the most exciting chapter, the ideas present here are at the very least neat, and it does play a major part in the game's story, but having to go through a chapter where Corrin pretty much kills everyone can get rather repetitive and tiresome. Not to mention the level design and enemies are rather basic, and not too much about the chapter stands out aside from the Dragon Vein concept. Though to be fair, it could work in your favour if Corrin just so happens to be underleveled at this point, but like most Fire Emblem lords, that never really happens. So after much thought and having to make a heartbreaking choice, you decided to fight against your Hoshido blood family and side with Nohr, which I'm sure was a very tough choice for everyone. Not for me though, I was Conquest from day one, so I didn't think twice about fighting against Hoshido. So anyway, Korin arrives back home, but Garen suspects him of being a spy and orders him killed. Well, that's certainly a nice way to greet your child, you ass! But after hearing the siblings out, Garen decides that Korin must be tested. And after being in Hoshido and fighting tons of Faceless, what do we do now that we're back in Nohr? Fight tons of Faceless again.
Riveting.
Well, it may not be the best way to start a Fire Emblem campaign, but there have been worse opening chapters. Anyway, coming in at number 9, we have the first proper chapter of Conquest in the game, A Dragon's Decree. And much like chapter 15, the chapter isn't inherently bad or anything, but also it's not the most exciting chapter either, which I would argue helps to ease the player into the experience, but then I remembered that this is Conquest, it doesn't ease you into anything. So in chapter 7, Korin has been sent off on a mission on his/her own, but along the way Korin is attacked by a Faceless, which at first spells out trouble, but then either Felicia or Sebastian, depending on whether Korin is male or female, comes in to help out. Yes, I know the male butler is actually called Jacob, but whenever I see him I think of Sebastian from Black Butler, so I'm calling him Sebastian. The objective of this mission is to defeat all the Faceless, which at first is rather daunting because you only have 2 units, but later down the road you get Silas, Elise, Effie and Arthur to help out in the fight. Now the mission is much more of a defensive mission since none of your units are at the point which they can one-shot a Faceless due to their bulk, so you have to focus on holding down points and healing very often in order to stay alive. While I think the level is overall fine and stresses the use of playing it safe rather than rushing in blind, it's not that exciting of a mission due to the rather simplistic nature of the map and the fact that you're just facing loads of Faceless and fighting them is dull in just about any Fire Emblem chapter they're featured in. Sometimes even the greatest of games don't start out that good and take a while to get going. I mean, look at Radiant Dawn, that game doesn't get good until part 3 and onwards. Conquest is yet another example of this since the first proper chapter of the game doesn't leave too much of an impression on you, and while it's not too bad, it's not exactly good either. Well, at the very least the next chapter of the game is really good, and I mean really good.
Gaze upon an empty white throne, a legacy of lies, a familiar disguise.
So the time has come. We've captured Sakura, Takumi has sold his soul, and Hinoka has retreated. It's time to face the eldest in the line to the throne and the strongest of the Hoshido royal family, RYOMA, in a one-on-one duel to decide the fate of each kingdom. Man, this shit is epic. It's a shame the chapter is a bit of a pain in the ass. Man, Conquest, you were so close to having one of the best chapters in the game. I mean, if everything went smoothly, we could have had this game's equivalent to Moment of Fate or Rebirth 2 from the Telia series, since the build-up, atmosphere and emotional weight of this chapter is on par with those chapters. The only problem is that there is one major factor that really holds this chapter back, making it one of the more frustrating Conquest chapters, and rather disappointing in that regard. So as you may have guessed, in chapter 25 we have to face off against RYOMA, who at this point is ready to give it his all, especially after believing that both Takumi and Hinoka are dead. The objective of this chapter is to defeat RYOMA, but the way you go about doing it is actually rather clever, and shows that this chapter has elements of strong level design, since RYOMA will wait at least 20 turns before actively going after you, and in that time you can either fight it by yourself, good luck with that, or get your units to tackle each side of the map and defeat both Saizo and Kagero in order to open the doors and help Korin fight RYOMA. I really like this design choice since it gives you many ways in which you can tackle this chapter depending on how you play Fire Emblem, and you've got plenty of time to defeat both retainers, giving you the freedom to change things up and adapt to the map. There is just one major problem with this map, and sadly it's the reason I don't like it: the enemy placement. Despite Conquest having very strong level design even in some of the worst chapters in the game, enemy placement is something Conquest does very poorly, and often results in very frustrating and downright brutal chapters in the game, which you're going to see a lot in this countdown. Chapter 25 is a prime example of this, since the map often crams many teamed up units into a single area that will instantly dogpile whichever unit they can, and since there is a very wide variety of enemies in one place along with very cramped corridors, it's very easy for them to bum rush you and kill you, especially with those bloody automatons who have the ability lunge and can swap places with you, allowing even more enemies to dogpile you. If it wasn't for this one factor, I could see chapter 25 as being one of the best chapters in the game, as the design, emotional weight and many other aspects of this chapter are great, but the enemy placement is what really hurts this chapter and makes it one of the most frustrating and tedious chapters in the game. While not as bad as most people say it is, I can understand why so many people hate this chapter, and it's rather sad since it had the potential to be one of the best chapters in the game. In fact, it was so disappointing that RYOMA killed himself afterwards. He hated it so much. I would make a joke about him being a drama queen, but that would be in bad taste given the situation and the context of the cutscene.
Days upon an empty white throne, a legacy of lies, a familiar disguise.
So RYOMA has left us and Hoshido is conquered. It's now time to reveal Garen's true form and show Xander and everyone else the monster that lies within. But before that, we have to kill these two fuckfaces. Well, this certainly has been long overdue. I mean, I wanted to kill these two assholes long before the 26th chapter in the game, but hey, better late than never, I guess. Now, even though I wanted to kill these two more than anything, it's a shame that the chapter itself is rather bland and anticlimactic, since you'd think a chapter where you take down the king's right-hand men would be rather epic and fill you with glee, when in actuality it's just rather eh. In chapter 26, Garen has gone to the throne room where his true identity will be revealed, but before that, Iago tries to kill Corrin for the I don't know how many times he's tried at this point, and since Garen is out the picture, Corrin, Azura, Xander and everyone else has had enough of their shit and decides that both Iago and Hans must die. About fucking time! This chapter feels very similar to chapter 25 in terms of layout, since you have to reach the center of the room and can either approach it by taking the left or right route or splitting your army up to go both sides and kill everyone, which I think helps to add some variety to this chapter and caters to those who prefer either offense or defense. Now, the chapter isn't too hard, but there are moments in this chapter that are rather tedious and can be quite disheartening, in particular the very start of the chapter. Right at the beginning of the chapter, you have to face off against a large amount of hero units that wield swords, axes, or both, so make sure you have a really good tank on standby, otherwise you will literally die straight out the gate. Thank you so much, Xander and Effie. Ironically, I find this to be the hardest part of the level, and since sometimes depending on the luck factor and the game's very hit and miss RNG, you can die right at the beginning, which can put you in a rather glum mood. Aside from that though, this chapter is just rather meh overall, with Iago's unlimited stars being a bit of a pain in the ass, and the fight between both Hans and Iago is piss easy, since Hans can't do shit to those with ranged attacks and Iago sucks against anyone with decent resistance. Camilla, you know what to do, honey. I think just about everyone wanted to kill both Hans and Iago very early on in the game. It's just a shame that we had to wait so long to do so, and in the end the result was really underwhelming and anticlimactic, so you barely remember the entire ordeal and won't care to go through it again. That's rather fitting for the textbook definition of Nohrian scum.
Days upon an empty white throne, a legacy of lies, a familiar disguise.
Treachery is a word often associated with Nohr due to their actions, which while not entirely true, is hard to overlook considering this guy is the monarch, because there's a face you can trust, isn't it? With this reputation behind them, it only seems fitting that at some point Nohr would be betrayed themselves. In fact, this betrayal took place in a den. Once again we have yet another infamous chapter from Conquest, since much like chapter 25, chapter 17, The Den of Betrayal, was infamous for being one of the worst chapters in the game. And while I don't think it's that bad, I won't deny it's definitely one of the hardest chapters in the game and one of the most tedious. In chapter 17, Corrin and the gang are walking through a cherry blossom forest when suddenly they are greeted by Kotaro, the leader of Mukushu, who we were warned about earlier by Shura, though he swears his allegiance to Nohr, so Corrin follows him as he leads into a supposed secret passage into Hoshido. After certain events take place, Kaze runs into Saizo, who explains that Kotaro was the one who killed their father, and now that the cat's out of the bag, Kotaro betrays you and thus you must fight your way out of the cave. The objective of this chapter is to defeat Kotaro, but the real challenge is reaching him in the first place, since this chapter is very boxed in and cramped, making progression rather slow and very often having you turtle in order to take on the enemies you will face. Now this chapter actually has some very good design features, since the enemies are split up into sections and are often filled with a certain class, so using the right class on them is often the best way to proceed, whereas running in blind will get you killed. I also love how the dragon veins are used in this chapter, since they will open and close certain entry points in the map. With this in mind, it encourages the player to think a lot more strategically and be aware of how to use the dragon veins without risking too much damage to yourself, which is something I really like about this chapter. Plus this chapter has treasure, which is always nice. Sadly, this chapter has some major flaws, the obvious one being, once again, the enemy placement. While the enemy is spread out all over the map, the amount of enemies you face in a group are just plain silly, and because most of the enemies are ninjas and master ninjas, which by themselves aren't too big of a problem to deal with, but in packs they are deadly, and most of this map is going to be facing hordes of them, so don't be surprised if even some of your best units just give up and die due to the onslaught of shurikens and poison strikes. Also, because of the amount of enemies and layout of the map, it can go on for what feels like forever, and having to restart the chapter and go through the process many times can really drain you more than any other chapter in the game. At this point in time, certain chapters in Conquest are going to go down in history as some of the most difficult and frustrating chapters in any Fire Emblem game, with chapter 17 being one of them. While I don't think the chapter is that bad, and to its credit there are a lot of features in the chapter that I really like, I won't deny that it's one of the most tedious chapters in the game and brings out some of the worst aspects of Conquest. Then again, after all the shit Nohr has put many other nations through, I guess they had it coming at this point.
There's upon an empty white throne, a legacy of lies, a familiar disguise.
Let's talk about chapter 10. Oh boy, this chapter. I mean, holy shit, this chapter is probably the most infamous chapter in Fates for either being one of the best or worst chapters in the game. While my opinion is in favour of the latter, I can certainly understand why people would say this is one of their favourite chapters, because chapter 10 has a lot of really good elements to it and I love the way this chapter is designed and structured. It's just a shame that these were overshadowed by the amount of frustration this chapter gave me. In chapter 10, Corrin and the gang have made it to port, but the Hoshido army is waiting for them along with the butthurt Takumi. The objective of this chapter is to defend the green spaces for 11 turns, so naturally most of the map is going to have you holding down choke points and preventing the enemy from getting through any openings. Now this chapter has loads of great things about it that makes it a very well made and challenging defense mission. First off, in this chapter you get Camilla and her retainers Baruka and Severa, I mean Selena, all of which can be very good units, in particular Camilla, who is going to be your best unit in this map as she's pretty much the only unit who can single-handedly kill just about every enemy. It's these types of qualities which elevate Camilla to the level of wife status along with Sumio and Faja. Secondly is that the way the map is laid out benefits you greatly, as there are a small number of entry points for the enemy that you can easily block, along with magic and bow turrets to use. Thirdly is that specific enemies will advance through specific areas, so if you use the right classes to defend against them, you shouldn't have much trouble. Not only that, but if you're good enough and can push through the enemy lines early on, you can reach houses around the middle of the map and collect bonuses. Much like chapter 8, I love this type of level design that rewards top-notch playing skills but doesn't punish low-level players too much. With all this praise at the helm, I bet you're wondering why I don't like this chapter. Well, that's to do with the fact that towards the end of the level, the game gets nasty. During the last couple of turns, Takumi will activate the Dragon Vein, draining the lake of water, allowing for many more entry points for units to break through. This alone is pretty bad, but in these last couple of turns the game goes nuts with the reinforcements and just bombards you with enemies making a beeline for the green tiles. Not hoping this is that a lot of them are paired up, so you have to be sure to kill them both without the aid of a support partner attack. It's these last couple of turns where the game shows you no mercy and becomes really difficult, as trying to hold down all the choke points and deal with a massive amount of enemies is not easy, along with trying to stay alive. And for the most part, Camilla and Corrin are the only units who can both kill the enemies easily and tank them as well. Other units can only do one but not the other, and it's at this point most players will die and have to do it all over again. It's for these reasons that people either love or hate chapter 10, and while this chapter has many great aspects like the design, new units, bonuses for top-notch players and so on, I cannot overlook just how brutal the game gets towards the end and how the final stretch will be where you die the most, which is really disheartening, especially in a Fire Emblem game. While I may not like this chapter too much, I can still appreciate all the good that comes from it, and this will be a chapter that goes down in Fire Emblem history for all the right and wrong reasons.
There's upon an empty white throne, a legacy of lies, a familiar disguise.
The climax to pretty much every Fire Emblem game is epic. In Blazing Sword you fight revived bosses, Nagal and a dragon. In Sacred Stones you face Lion, a demon army and the Demon Lord himself. In Path of Radiance you face Ashnard and the strongest of the Dagon army. And in Conquest you fight a handful of enemies and Garon the Blob Monster. Yay? Man, you'd think after fighting RYOMA the climax to Conquest would only build up from there, not get weaker, since not only was fighting both Hans and Iago anticlimactic, but you face off against Garen's true form and it's arguably even more anticlimactic. Kind of dropped the ball on this one, Conquest. Anyway, coming in at number 4 we have Chapter 27, The Empty King. Arguably one of the easiest and downright dullest final chapters in any Fire Emblem game, though technically it's not the true final level of the game, but we'll get there soon enough. In Chapter 27, Corrin and Azura reveal their true intentions to the Nohr family, and after opening the doors to the throne room, they see King Garen's true form, a weird ass blob monster. To be fair, I thought he would look more like a pig monster than a blob. Don't lie to me, you made that connection at some point too. In this chapter you have to defeat all the enemies before the door will open, and then you can tackle Garen head on. For a final level, this chapter is very short and rather easy, since there aren't many enemies to fight, and Garen himself is pretty easy to beat with just Corrin alone. But I find this chapter to be a very luck-based chapter as well. I say it's luck-based in the sense that at the beginning of the chapter, 4 staff users will transport 4 units to one of the rooms in the map with a certain enemy in it, and you can't escape the room until you beat the enemy. Now sometimes if you get the right unit transported to a room with an enemy they can easily defeat, there's no problem. But other times it's the complete opposite, since the unit could get picked that stands no chance against the enemy, pretty much forcing you to restart and hope that next time the right unit gets picked for the right room. Now you can pair up units to make it easier just in case luck isn't in your favour, but something like this is really unwarranted, since it's less about skill and more pure luck, and no chapter in Fire Emblem should be solely determined by luck alone. Even with this complaint out of the way, the chapter is still way too easy and short for a final level or even semi-final level, and considering the last chapter had you fight a massive amount of enemies and 2 bosses, this feels like a major step back to what could have been the most epic fight in any Fire Emblem game. Fire Emblem games, regardless of how good they are, have always had epic final levels, but Conquest sadly dropped the ball on this one, as the level is too short, too easy and very luck based. You could argue that this signifies the emptiness of Garen now that everyone is against him, which is why it's so easy. Personally, I just feel this level didn't amount to much in the end, and if I knew Garen was this easy, I'd have killed him much sooner.
There's upon an empty white throne, a legacy of lies, a familiar disguise.
Fighting hordes of enemies in Fire Emblem is commonplace at this point, and I rather enjoy it since it's lots of fun to take down entire armies with a small bunch of units, and it emphasises using each class's unique skills to conquer the horde. However, fighting hordes of enemies for a very long time could start to drain you very quickly and become really boring and monotonous, or nowhere in Conquest or how Fire Emblem in general is this better shown than in the Eternal Stairway. Oh boy, this is where the hate begins. While I don't like the previous chapters on this list, at the very least I didn't think they were awful, and some of them have a lot of redeeming qualities. The next 3 chapters on this list? Fuck them, they're dreadful, and chapter 21 is just the tip of the iceberg. In chapter 21, after passing the Wind Tribe's test, Corrin and the gang make their way up the Eternal Stairway, where they run into dead Hoshido soldiers, much to their surprise. Before they have time to think who the culprit is, a horde of faceless attack, and their group must fight their way through them in order to escape. The purpose of this chapter is to make your way up the stairway, defeat the hordes of faces along the way and have all of your units escape. Not 1, not 2, I mean all of your units have to escape. Now this chapter isn't too hard since faceless aren't the most difficult enemies in the game, and the dragon veins in this chapter, which there are plenty of, allow you to freeze all the enemies in place, which is very useful when you want to take out a large group of faces before they can dogpile you. While this does take the edge off, this chapter still turns out to be one of the most frustrating chapters, not for the difficulty, but for the sheer amount of tediousness of fighting faceless after faceless, which respawn in this chapter from both the top and bottom of the map. I'm just going to come out and say it. Fighting faceless in Fates is boring and pretty much every chapter therein is dull. This is something that applies to both Conquest and Birthright, since I find chapters that feature them in both pathways to be pretty damn boring, and Birthright is filled to the brim with these guys. So not only is this chapter dull and tedious, but what makes it worse are those bloody golems that can seriously damage a unit with low defenses and have ridiculous range unless frozen, not to mention most faces have the skill Savage Blow, which piles on and will bite you in the ass when that one faceless lands a lucky hit, which can very easily happen because of Fate's fucked up RNG. Fighting hordes of enemies in Fire Emblem can be fun, but fighting hordes of faceless is never a fun time for me. and this chapter is by far the worst of it. On top of dealing with way too many faceless, most of which have annoying skills, there's the issue of the rock golems, the constantly respawning units, and the fact that every unit has to make its way to the finish line in order to clear the chapter. Monotony, thy name is chapter 21! Well, that's one of the Conquest terrible trio down, only 2 more left, and it only gets worse from here.
There's upon an empty white throne, a legacy of lies, a familiar disguise.
So the finale of Conquest is approaching us and we've nearly conquered Hoshido. Sakura is captured and Takumi is, well, you know. Now it's time to fight HINOKA in chapter 24, and this chapter made me realize something. As much as I like the dragon veins and find them to be a really cool mechanic, sometimes I fucking hate them. Oh Jesus, this chapter is so much worse than it should have been. Chapter 24, otherwise known as, well, HINOKA, is a chapter that doesn't seem too bad at first, and the layouts and overall look of this chapter is really nice. It's only when HINOKA activates the dragon veins do you start to see just how horrid this chapter really is, and it will make you hate flying units with a burning passion. Well, enemy flying units, I could never hate Camilla. In chapter 24, Korin is nearing the finish line of conquering Hoshido, and now you have to defeat HINOKA, go figure. Now this chapter is one of the larger maps in the game, allowing your units lots of space to move about and traverse the map whichever way you see fit, so depending on how you play Fire Emblem, the map won't hinder you in any way. The only problem is that all the space isn't for you, it's for the enemy to take advantage of through the use of the dragon veins HINOKA activates every so often. The dragon veins in this chapter, if used by you, increase the movement of ground units and slow down flying units. However, if HINOKA activates it, the reverse happens, and this is really bad since this chapter is filled with flying units and they can reach your units so easily and dogpile you at a moment's notice. Now while you can slow them down and pretty much have to if you want to stand any chance of winning, HINOKA is able to activate the dragon veins an unlimited amount of times, and this is made worse by the fact that there are many respawning units in this map, often catching you off guard and unable to escape due to the change in movement caused by the dragon vein. Not to mention, the only way to counter HINOKA is to activate the dragon vein after she does, but the only unit who can do this is Camilla since she's the only royal flying unit if we're looking at the base class alone, unless you pair someone up with Baruka, so if they're not within range of a dragon vein, you're fucked. Because of the amount of respawning units and spamming of the dragon veins, this chapter is very back and forth with progression, as having to deal with the enemies and keep on countering the dragon veins in order to stay alive is just ridiculous. As such, this chapter goes on for ages and gets really frustrating and tedious trying to deal with all this shit at one time. And yes, I know you can beat this chapter in 2 turns, but I didn't do that on my playthrough and instead had to deal with everything bad about this chapter. As much as I hate this chapter, at the very least I like the idea they had going with the dragon veins, as well as the overall look of the map. Plus it has one of my favourite Camilla moments where she actively fucks with HINOKA and teases her, though her intentions are good. I'm really looking forward to seeing their supports and revelations. In the end, chapter 24, while sounding cool on paper, just sucks at the end of the day, being so back and forth and really annoying with the amount of respawning units and the annoying dragon veins. But at the very least this chapter had some redeeming qualities. The last chapter on this list is just plain shit.
There's upon an empty white throne, a legacy of lies, a familiar disguise.
So we've reached the number 1 spot, and now it's time to reveal what I think is the worst chapter in Conquest, and how fitting that the final entry on this list goes to the final chapter in the game. Oh, you thought chapter 27 was the final chapter? No silly, that's just the prelude. The next chapter is the true endgame. And it is dreadful! I hate this chapter so damn much. I honestly don't think I've hated any chapter in Fire Emblem as much as this one. I mean, I've said my piece about the previous chapters in Conquest, as well as Battle Before Dawn, Day in Arise, Daybreaks, and so on, but none of those chapters compared to the atrocity that is the endgame of Conquest. Except for maybe chapter 14 of Binding Blade. That was pretty damn bad. It's such a shame too, ending Conquest on such a low note after what is easily one of the strongest entries in the Fire Emblem series. I think Fates followed in Awakening's footsteps a little too much. Anyway, in the endgame of Conquest, Gowron is dead, and it's time to end this war for good. But not before Takumi comes back, and now he's so butthurt, he's glowing purple and actually manages to kill you. Sort of. After ripping off every anime ever made and going to heaven only to come back 5 minutes later, Korin is ready to defeat Takumi and release his soul so he can rest in peace. It's just a shame that the process of doing so is utter horseshit. So in this chapter you have to defeat Takumi, but first you must get past the many enemies that block your path, all of which are very high leveled, have dangerous weapons and respawn very often. Not helping this is that Takumi will shoot a wave of energy every couple of turns that will hurt anyone who isn't hiding behind a rock or a dragon vein rock, which will often be your tanks that are getting ready to tank the enemy, so there's a good chance that the initial damage will result in their inevitable death. Making this worse is that if you try to take things slowly, the amount of reinforcements will overwhelm you and most likely kill you as they come from both the front and the back. But you can't go too fast, otherwise the units defending Takumi will get the jump on you. But you can't go too slow because of the respawning units. But you can't go too fast because of the enemy guards. But you can't really do anything because the game's driving you fucking crazy! And the absolute worst part is that if you die or one of your units die and you need to restart as a result, you don't start back at the beginning of the chapter. No, you have to start back at chapter 27 and go through all that again in order to be back at the endgame. That is bullshit! Why do you have to go back to the previous chapter? Why can't I start from the endgame? No other Fire Emblem game made me do this, so what's this game's excuse? It just makes all the problems with the endgame much worse, and yeah, chapter 27 isn't hard, but that doesn't change the fact that you have to go through it again, and it's just a huge waste of time. Which is why the endgame of Fire Emblem Fates Conquest takes the #1 spot as the worst chapter in Fire Emblem Fates Conquest. This has been CRASHX500. I wish you all a great night, take care, and even though Conquest has some pretty bad chapters, I still think it has some of the best level design and chapters in just about any Fire Emblem game. Well, I think that's enough about Conquest for now, so the next time we meet, it's time for us to look at the other side of the spectrum, as I go forth to claim my birthright.